Welcome back, Epic families. I'm so excited to be in front of you again, being able to talk about Habakkuk Chapter 2. I hope you had a great conversation and great family time last week. I hope you learned something, even if it was just that some DMs and the best DMs are the healthy ones. All right, let's get into it. So, a question we kept on asking last week is, what do we do when we hit that spiritual wall? When we're wrestling with doubt, remember that crisis of belief on that little wave chart that I drew. When we believe God can, but God doesn't. And what we know about God isn't aligning with what we're seeing happening around us. And that's the series. That's the book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk is a tough book, but I love it because it's real. It's raw. It's honest. Habakkuk is just telling us how he feels, the confusion that he feels, the frustration. Many of you said last week's teaching was a bit rough, a bit raw, a bit convicting, but I hope that you were able to learn something from it. And I hope that that also sparked great conversation, like I said. But I want to remind you that this isn't a sitcom sermon. This isn't a sitcom series. Remember, a sitcom is a show that, including commercials, it's 30 minutes, right? There's a problem, there's some conversation, there's a solution, and there's a climax, and then everybody gets to go home, right? But that's not what the book of Habakkuk is about. Habakkuk chapter 1, I encouraged you not to walk away in chapter 1. And Habakkuk 2 is about not quitting on God. So chapter 1 was about wondering. Don't walk away from God in chapter 1. We kept on asking God, I believe you can, I know you can, but I just don't see it. God, you're not doing what I think you should, and I don't understand why. And chapter 2 is about waiting. In this culture, it's so hard to wait. It's so hard to understand what waiting means. We're so prone to instant gratification, right? You Google something, instantly you have any information that you need, right? You text someone, you expect them to text you back pretty much right away. If you're left on red, that's like one of the worst things that can happen. But Habakkuk is about not walking away in chapter 1 and not quitting on God in chapter 2. And so real quick, I want you to pause the video and talk about why waiting is really hard and what challenges that you've had in waiting. So let's review chapter 1 real quick. Let's go through it real quick. So remember, who was Habakkuk? Habakkuk was a minor prophet. He lived 600 years and he wrote 600 years before the birth of Christ. And remember, his nation, the nation of Judah, was blessed, but now it was experiencing some turmoil, some frustration. There was a lot of crime. There was a lot of sin happening. And we kept on hearing Habakkuk say, God, I don't understand why you're not doing what I think you should do. I don't think it's very fair. You're supposed to be just, and you're not being just, or at least in the way that I see it. Where are you, God, and why aren't you doing what I think you should do? And remember what God says. God says, even if I told you what I was going to do, you wouldn't believe it. And Habakkuk thinks, when God says that he's going to make everything right. He's going to solve all Habakkuk's problems. He's going to raise Judah up back to a blessed nation. But God says, Habakkuk, I'm about to do something, and I'm going to bring justice to you, but just not in the way you think. And to Habakkuk, this doesn't make sense. This isn't the God that he thought that he was following. In chapter 1, he's wondering, God, why don't you do what I want you to do? And then Habakkuk chapter 2, which we're in today, he's waiting on God. God, when are your promises going to come true? Are any of you waiting right now? Are any of you experiencing what it's like to wait? And this may not just be you waiting. Maybe you're waiting on a friend. I know for me personally, I'm waiting on one of my friends that I've been trying to pour into to come back. He says he's a believer, but he's walking a life of an unbeliever. He continues to pile hardship upon hardship and just do things against God, even though he knows the truth. Last week I shared with you guys one of Kate and I, one of our friends, his mom was re-diagnosed with cancer. And their family was waiting. They were waiting on a miracle. But sometimes God doesn't answer your cries and your cry outs and your frustration in a way that you think he should. And sadly, his mom went on to be with Christ. And I'm sure that's not what they wanted to happen. But sometimes God answers you in a way that you didn't think you wanted to hear. And I know that last week was a little bit tough, but welcome back to WL Epic Families Week 2. So I want to go through 3 things that God tells us to do in Habakkuk Chapter 2. But before I do that, go ahead and pause the video and read Habakkuk Chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, and talk about what Habakkuk does in preparation for God's response. So go ahead and pause the video real quick. So I want to look very specifically at 3 things that Habakkuk does that we should do when we're hurting, when we're wondering, when we don't know exactly what to do. Let me show you the first thing that Habakkuk does. And some of you should do this. This is what you need to do when you're hurting, when you're wondering. And the first thing Habakkuk does is he listens. Habakkuk doesn't walk away. He doesn't quit. He instead, in verse 1, he positions himself in the most strategic place for him to see what God is about to do. Chapter 2, verse 1 says, I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what God will say to me. Habakkuk says, I will look to see what God, he'll look to see what he says. And this isn't easy to do when we're hurting. Because when we're hurting, that's often when we want to tell God what we think he should do. Because when we're hurting, it's easy to go outward towards other things because you don't want to accept or experience what you're feeling. And Habakkuk puts himself in a place that he can see what God's going to do. But I'm sure oftentimes we feel like when we're hurting, like, God, this doesn't seem what I want it to be. It doesn't seem like it's right. God, why do you continue to let my friend who says he knows you walk away and pile things on himself? I'm sure we continue to ask God, why does it seem like this world is so broken? And you may say, I know what I want from God, but I encourage you to listen to what God says. God often speaks to us, not in an audible way. He can speak audibly, but oftentimes he speaks to us in situations, in circumstances, through people, through us to other people, through songs, through sermons. But oftentimes he'll speak to you loudest through the Holy Spirit in your soul. And oftentimes that speaking will be louder than we could even hear it audibly. But if he doesn't, don't panic. Because just because he's not speaking, silence doesn't mean absence. Sometimes he does speak. But let me warn you, often when you think that you want to hear something from God, it's not going to be what you actually want to hear. You may not always like what he says. Just like Habakkuk, he thought God was going to solve his problems, and God says, you know what, I'm going to solve your problems. But to do it, I'm going to raise up the Babylonians to bring you justice. And I'm sure Habakkuk was like, hold on, God, that's not exactly what I was looking for. I kind of asked you to do this thing, but you decide to kind of do the opposite of what I'm asking. Habakkuk says, that's not what I wanted to hear. But sometimes God will speak to you, but he might just say something you don't really want to hear. Someone that's a great example of this is the Apostle Paul. In the New Testament, 2 Corinthians, Paul was someone that probably deserved for God to do what he asked more than anybody else. In 2 Corinthians 5, we see something described that Paul had a thorn in his side. And lots of theologians or scholars have said a bunch of different things. Maybe it was like, depression, or it was an addiction, or it was like some physical impairment. We don't know what it was. It doesn't really matter. But Paul he experienced 3 seasons of pleading. So he pleaded with God to take this thorn away. He says, God, I'll do anything. Have mercy on me. Take it away, take it away, take it away. And God spoke to him, and he didn't do what Paul was asking. He said no. He said, you asked, but my answer is no. And then God said, my grace is enough for you. He didn't say what Paul wanted to hear. And if I'm Paul, I'm probably pushing back a bit on God. I'm like, God, listen, like I deserve this. I mean, I don't want your grace, God. I want your power. Give Peter your grace. He denied you not once, not twice, but 3 times. I want your power, God, to solve my problems. God, I don't want your grace. Give Thomas your grace. He's the one that said, I'm not going to believe until I see. God, I don't want your grace. I want your power. If it was me, I'd be reminding God, remember when I was beaten for you? Remember when I was shipwrecked? I was snake bitten. I was stoned, not recreationally. And after all I've been through for you, I want your power. And God says, no, my grace is enough. What you want, he's saying to Paul, what you want is not what I'm going to give you, but what I'm going to give you is so much more than you thought that you needed. First we listen, and then 2, we write. In verse 2 it says, then the Lord replied, write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets. This is a really clear verse. God says, document it, record what I have to say, write it down. And why do we write things down? We do this because we have a very real spiritual enemy that wants to destroy the peace that God gives us. We have a real spiritual enemy that wants to make you forget the things that God has promised you. Maybe last week after you heard this teaching, you were encouraged, or you felt that spiritual wind blowing you towards a more fulfilled or closer feeling to God. And then maybe the next day you went to school and you felt discouraged again, or the anxiety started to slip back in, or the feeling of depression started to come back. And God gives you peace, but sometimes life distracts us from it. Satan wants to take from us what God has to give to us. So that's why we need to anchor it. We need to write it down so we can go back to it in those seasons of frustration. And sometimes we're like Paul and Silas when they were in prison. Long before those things that shackle them came free. And long before those things that shackle us come free, we're praising God. We need to praise God in advance before the miracle happens. They were thanking Him for His goodness. And to listen to what God has to say to you, to remember it down the road, you need to write it down. And the third and final thing is probably the most painful, and it's always the hardest for me, and that's wait. That's waiting. I'm waiting and asking, will my friend come back? Will he realign his life? Maybe you're asking, God, am I actually going to find real friends at school? God, are you going to heal my parents' marriage? God, are you going to take this depression from me? God, are you going to speak to me in a way that I have been asking? Verse 3 in chapter 2 says, for the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come, and it will not delay. Good things take time. God may be preparing something for you, something specific for your situation, but maybe you have to wait. A cheesy cliche that's really easy to understand is sometimes the best meals or the best desserts take time to bake. It takes time to prepare. Maybe God is preparing that gourmet dessert for you. It's just not quite ready yet. And I really like the New Living Translation of Habakkuk Chapter 2, verse 3. It says, but these things I plan won't happen right away. Slowly, steadily, surely the time approaches when the vision will be fulfilled. If it seems slow, do not despair, for these things will surely come to pass. Just be patient. They will not be overdue a single day. At the appointed time, God will deliver. At the appointed time, He will respond, and at the appointed time, His perfect will be done. In fact, I love the word in Hebrew that translates to appointed time. It's actually the word moed. Moed literally means perfect, unstoppable timing of God. God's timing is perfect. But if it's not God's time, you can't force it to become God's time. But when it is God's time, you also can't stop it. Though it linger, wait for it. God's delays are not His denials. Just because you haven't seen it does not mean that God is not going to do it. Though it linger, wait for it. At God's appointed time, it will come to pass. In verse 4 of chapter 2, many theologians say is the most important verse in Habakkuk chapter 2. It's not my favorite verse, but maybe it is the most important. And remember, Habakkuk is beside himself, right? The Babylonians are going to bring them justice, and Habakkuk is asking God, when are the Babylonians going to get their justice? When are they going to get their due? And if you read Habakkuk 2, there's what's known as the 5 woes of Babylon. And basically, in a gist, God says, I'm going to get them, 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 I'm going to get them. And God says, they're going to get theirs, Habakkuk. Don't worry, I'm a just God. Remember, I keep telling you this, I'm just. And Habakkuk's saying, God, when are you going to bring justice on us? When are you going to bring justice on them? I don't understand. And he's confused. And this is what God says. God acknowledges the Babylonians. And in verse 4, he says, see the enemy. And he's talking about Babylon is puffed up. His desires are not upright. The righteous person will live by God's faithfulness. The righteous will live by faith. Our faith is not based in a result that we want from God. Our faith is based in the character and nature of God. And even when God can, and he doesn't, even when God wills it, but it's not the right time yet, we'll still believe. No matter what I see or what I feel, we should still choose faith. Our faith is not based on what we see, but it's based on the character of God. Even when we don't see a way, the Lord can make a way. Even when we're losing hope, the Lord can still supply you with that hope. And even when you're hurting and afraid, the Lord will never leave us. You may say, even though I don't see it with my eyes, God, I will fight to trust you. God, with my heart, even though everything I want you to do and you're not doing, I'll wait for it. I'll wait. Though it linger, wait for it. Habakkuk 2, chapter 20 says, but the Lord is in his temple. And Habakkuk is disturbed. Remember, he's confused, he's upset, he's angry. He knows the Babylonians are going to come bring them justice. And this is almost like him reminding himself of the truth of God. This is him embracing the truth of God, saying, but the Lord is still in his holy temple. Remember, this is not a sitcom sermon. The name Habakkuk doesn't mean to wrestle and endure. The name Habakkuk means to wrestle with what you see while you embrace the truth of God. Chapter 1, we see Habakkuk in the wondering. But don't walk away from God in chapter 1. In chapter 2, we see Habakkuk in the waiting. But don't walk away from God in chapter 2. When it's God's time, you can't force it. But when it is God's time, you can't stop it. So go ahead and wrestle. Go ahead and decide not to let go. Go ahead and decide not to walk away in chapter 1 in the wondering, or in chapter 2 in the waiting. But what happens in chapter 3? Well, you have to come next week to find out. But remember, you can't get to chapter 3 without experiencing chapter 1 and chapter 2. And to tie it all together, remember who was Jesus. He is the Son of God. He is the perfect incarnation in every way. He died and he gave his life for us. And when he died, everyone waited. They were saying, where is he? And then a day passed. And they were saying, where is he? And then a day passed. And then on the third day, when the stone was rolled away, it was an empty tomb. He had arisen so that everyone, that anyone, and that includes you, who calls on his name, will be saved, forgiven, and made new. So sometimes we wait on God, but other times God waits on us. Remember, if it's not God's time, you can't force it. And when it is God's time, you can't stop it. And so for one of you, maybe this is the time that God is not allowing you to stop. Be honest with yourself. Be honest with God. If you feel like this is your time to give your life to call on God's name and be forgiven, then talk to one of your leaders. It doesn't have to be in front of your group. It doesn't have to be in front of anybody else. It's a personal experience for you. But I know your leader would love to have that conversation with you. And that's what this is all about. You finding your relationship with Christ. But I encourage you, don't walk away in chapter 1 or 2, because to get to chapter 3, you have to wonder and you have to wait. But we know that God and his truth is still there. Leaders, do you have your questions? I love you guys. I'm so honored to be able to teach in front of you again. But until next week, have a great rest of your epic family. See you guys later.